Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is an action plan. In other words, what you need to do to actually start moving ahead. And the first thing on the action plan is you need to treat this like a business. Why do you need to treat it like a business, do you think?
Because it is.
Because it is. Why else? Sure, but why else? Why are you going to sort of treat something as a business if you're going to be an investor? Make money.
So you'll be serious about it.
So you'll be serious about it. We've already said that the average investor buys how many properties? One. Why? Because they have a bad experience. Because most people get involved in property who invest. It's like no other industry I know. They buy property, they almost fall over it. They think, oh, I better do something. They buy the first thing that comes along. They do little or no research. They have a bad experience with a property manager. They buy a piece of garbage that gets wrecked by tenants because they're the sort of tenants the property attracts in the first place. And they say, this is terrible. I'm never going to invest in a property again. And that's what happens to most people. They have a bad experience. Now, if you're treating this like a business and you do all your research, you've got your life plan. I hope everybody went home last night and started writing their life plan. Did everybody do that? Yeah.
You told us we're too tired.
I did not say that you were too tired. I tell you what, I know who I'm going to be getting to volunteer up the front here a bit later on. Sleep, too tired, okay. But the reality is that if you plan and you do these things correctly, you're far more likely to be successful by treating it as a business. Now, what's one of the things that you need if you have a business? A business plan. Well, that's going to go hand in hand with the life plan and the investment plan we're talking about. So absolutely you need that. But what does a business do? What often does a business do?
Makes money.
Makes money, hopefully. But what else? What do a lot of small businesses do? Go broke. There's always one, isn't there? What else? Yeah, but I'm thinking more in terms of what do people do with a small business often? Or a large business? What do they have? Staff, employees. Now, the great thing about running a property business is you don't actually physically need to employ people. But what you can do is you can employ the best people on a contract basis who are going to look after your business for you. And those sort of people, who would they include, do you think? Property manager, an accountant, solicitor, all these sort of things are ultra important, aren't they? We're going to hear from a quantity surveyor later on today from BMT. In my opinion, the best quantity surveyors in Australia. Okay? Why? Because they actually tell the tax department what you can claim. Do you want a good quantity surveyor? Or do you want to take the one from the developer that's normally shortchanged because it's been done on the cheap and often will not include half the stuff that's there? So they're the sort of things that you need. You need a good property accountant, a good property solicitor, people that really know what they're doing. And yes, you will pay for those services. I mean, those of you who saw I'm sure you all saw our accountant Warren Black last night. Would anyone walk away from listening to Warren and think he doesn't know what he's talking about? No. So would you prefer Warren Black, or would you prefer somebody that's on a street corner from a chain who really just does tax returns? Who do you want representing you to set up your business for you? So, I'm in America, for instance, and I'm using this just as an example for what I do with my own business. The accounting firm that I use in Texas is the second largest accounting firm in Texas. And the reason I use them? Because they're the best. They speak on the international stage about investing in the United States. So since I'm looking at foreign investors investing in America, naturally I want a company that knows what they're talking about. And it's the same for you. If you're looking at accounting here, you want to use somebody like Warren Black who is going to set up your structures and do everything for you before you even commence. And that's all part of setting up your business. When you set up your business, you need to look at your insurances and all these type of things as well. And unfortunately, we see this happen every day where people get into debt and something happens to their health and they end up having to sell. Now, it's okay if you're in a rising market. What happens if you're in a bad market and you've got to sell everything? Good? So this is what I mean. When you're planning your business, you need to look at all of these things really before you start. They're absolutely critical to how successful you may or may not be. Develop an absolute commitment to your financial success. Now, what that means is for those of you in the room who said, for instance, that they want to trade property or they want to renovate or they want to do these sort of things, how well do you think you need to understand a marketplace to do that? You have to know it back to front, okay? But if you're going to invest, you need to be able to do your own research. And even if we say to you, look, we've got a great project that we think you should take a look at, you should at least do your own research or be comfortable that what we are saying is correct. And why is that, do you think? Yeah, but why?
Because at the end it's your money.
It's your money. I don't have any financial involvement in what we recommend to you. Now, we're very careful about what we recommend, but I'd still suggest to you that despite that fact, you should do your own checks and balances to be comfortable with the decision that you're making with your money. It amazes me how many people will buy things, get involved in products, and they're going along with something even though they don't really understand what they're doing, and yet they're investing their own money. Shouldn't ever put yourself in that position. Now, we're not deliberately going to mislead you, but let me tell you, there's a lot of companies out there who run seminars and do these sort of things that are purely there to flog product to you. And that's what they'll do. And they'll set their whole picture up just to do that alone. So that's why you've really got to take in what you receive, but be very, very careful about it. Now, developing an absolute commitment to your financial success means that you've also got to put the time in. In other words, you might not be able to go to the football on the weekends. You might actually have to start looking at property. You have to decide what you're going to give up initially to put the time in. Because if anybody that's ever been in their own business knows, does it take time to start making a return? Of course it does. Because you've got to set it up, you've got to do all of those things. So that's the first thing. Clearly define your goals, plans and vision. Now I know people say, here he goes again, he's harping on about this subject. But again, if you don't have those things developed, how are you going to be successful? Does anybody believe that you can go ahead, be really successful without planning? Or without setting your goals, or without knowing where you're going in life? People simply drift in life. Most people, I guarantee you out there, drift through their lives. Haven't you ever heard people say, gee, I can't believe my kids are now 20. What happened to the last 30 years? You hear people that are retired who say the same thing. What happened? Don't be in that position. The only way you can guarantee that is lifelong. No, it's short, isn't it? It disappears. It goes like that. So what you want to do is make the most of every day of it. So if you plan, you have far more opportunities to be successful than if you don't. Be passionate about your future. Now, I don't know about you. Maybe you can be successful if you don't really care. Some people will tell you they can. For my way of thinking, if I'm not passionate about what I'm doing, I get bored really easily and I walk away from it. Okay? So be passionate. And if property investment's not your passion, find something that is. Okay? We're not here to push this down your throat. This is a vehicle to help you do it, but I think you'll enjoy the vehicle far more if you actually take an interest in what you're doing and if you become passionate. Property is actually good fun. Okay? And the more you can learn about it, the more fun that it is. I often say to people that the more I know about property, the less I do. Because it's such a monster. And to try and understand all aspects of it, it's very, very difficult. You could spend forever studying it. And that's really what I do. I'm a researcher really more than anything else. I spend most of my time researching the marketplace. And it's great fun and it provides a lot of great knowledge. And you can do the same thing yourself, even if it's in a more narrow sense, just depending on what you want to do. But you've got to become passionate. You've got to wake up every morning thinking it's another day. Great. I'm not saying I do that every day either, but you know what I mean. It's a matter of waking up every day looking forward to what you're going to do and planning ahead rather than, I've got to go to work. Learn how to plan for your desired lifestyle in both the short and the long term. Now, this is important because I think we've said to you already, one of the things that you really want to do is reward yourself along the way. If you have some successes, reward yourself with a bit of luxury. I mean, people will say to you, don't buy plasmas, don't buy cars, don't buy this, don't buy that. And if you've got absolutely nothing else, you shouldn't, especially if you're doing it all on credit. But if you're having some successes, what's wrong with having a nice plasma screen on the wall? Or driving a nice car, or doing something like that? If it makes you feel better about yourself and you enjoy those things, then there's nothing wrong with doing it, is there? It's a personal thing. Continually acquire more education and knowledge. Now, this is the other thing. You can never learn enough. And I really mean that. There really isn't a time where you can stop learning. I mean, from my point of view, I read through the papers virtually every day in most states online. That's the great thing about the internet. You can now really look at papers all over the world online to find out what's happening in a particular marketplace. Look at the property sections, look at the business sections of the paper, find out what's going on. One of the things I'll talk to you about later on is that we're now running these Property Express weekends. Now these are being run out all over Australia. And the reason being we're doing this is for serious investors who would like to potentially look at another marketplace to invest in, or your own local marketplace for that matter, but actually be shown the market. Okay, so you can do it comfortably with some knowledge. Does everyone think that's a good idea?
Yep.
Yeah. It's a lot easier, isn't it, than just going in blindly somewhere. So if you decide you want to invest in another state, we can actually show you that state, talk to you about some of the parameters and the research that we've done as to why we're investing there. And let us use our knowledge to help you. One of the great things about belonging to the academy or being able to come along to these functions is that we're really here to help you and to provide these sort of services, because our only interest is in making sure that you make the right decisions in your investing future. And if you want to put this purely into a business sense, it makes far more sense for us that you're successful so you'll come back and use our services again. And that's the philosophy we have. We have a business here that we want to be involved in what we're doing here with Property Direct in 10 years. Our goal with Property Direct is for this to be the largest property and education business in Australia. That's what we want to do. And the only way you do that is by providing people with good service and helping them. Okay, so what constitutes a good investment, do you reckon? Not all at once. Location, what else?
Buying below market.
Yeah, buying below market. Not always as easy as you think, particularly in a rising market. It's very difficult to do that. I can tell you that I've paid over the odds sometimes for properties, but if I think it's a good long-term investment, you get what you pay for a lot of the time, I find from experience. The first thing that we look at is consistent capital growth of over 10% averaged out over 10 years. Now, you're going to hear a lot about things like median prices. You get the paper and it says that median prices in a particular city have gone up by 15% in a year. Is it true? It's rubbish. And do you know why it's rubbish? Does anybody actually know what median prices are? Median prices are based on the sales that have taken place during a period of time. So, for instance, you could have a suburb like Cannon Hill, just to use an example of a project that we've had, where you could have a brand new project there that sells for $450,000, $500,000, but the month before there were old units that sold and they were $350,000. Now, in the paper, the press would get hold of this and say, dramatic jump in the marketplace, but does it actually mean that all the properties have gone up to $450,000, $500,000? Of course it doesn't. And that's the problem with a lot of the median prices. They talk about the market from month-to-month basis, and it's totally inaccurate. What we tend to do, we look at figures over a minimum of 10 years and ideally 20 to get a reflection of what the market's doing. For instance, it's very rare that we would ever make a recommendation to you in a new area, right? Unless we had very, very strong evidence to substantiate it. Because we're historians. We're actually not here to speculate with your money. What we're here to do is we're here to actually advise you what's working and what's likely to work for a number of different factors, which we explain to you. Reliable and consistent rental income. Now again, where do you think you're going to be? I think Conrad mentioned this yesterday. Where are you going to be getting better rental income? In the house and land package that's 40 kilometres out of the city, where you've got people renting that can't afford the basic house and land, or a young professional who is renting near the city because they might be investing themselves. Who do you think is more likely to be the better tenant? Yeah. So, I mean, that's the sort of thing that we look at. We look at, for instance, what type of tenants are actually attracted to a given area. If you're in an area where it's all subsidised rent because the people are low economic, I mean, I feel sorry for those people, don't get me wrong, but do I necessarily want those people as a tenant? No, I don't. It's somebody else's problem. Tax advantages. I mean, obviously, we're one of the highest tax countries in the world. And we are. If you actually work out how much tax we're paying on virtually everything, the average person in the room would be absolutely shocked. In a lot of other countries, for instance, such as America, you don't pay any fees on your bank accounts. Look at how many taxes we pay alone, just on our bank accounts alone here. So we really are slugged through the nose on virtually everything. But we can depreciate things to a large degree. I might tell you that depreciation in Australia is nowhere near as generous as it is in New Zealand or America, for instance. In New Zealand, for instance, you don't have capital gains tax, nor do you have stamp duty. Guess what? Those things were abolished when they brought a GST in. Funny that, isn't it? All the benefits of having states. Is property low risk? Okay. Yeah, I mean, when have you ever heard a property reduced to zero overnight? It doesn't happen, because a residential property always has an intrinsic value, doesn't it? And generally it holds up pretty well. Now, liquidity, if you have shares, what do you have to do to get the money? Okay, with property what happens? You can create a line of credit so you can go and buy that Mercedes Benz you never thought you could afford. Problem is you've still got to pay it back. But it enables you to borrow against an asset to create more money. Now you tell me, is that a pretty good facility if you're careful with it? But again, why you need to set this up as a business is you've got to appreciate that yes, you can borrow against your house, but it's like a credit card on low interest. You still have to pay it back and it still appreciates and you've still got to pay the interest on it. But if you use it wisely and carefully, it'll work out well for you. And importantly, you always stay in control. What happens when you're dealing with the stock market? And the issue I have with the stock market more than anything else, I mean, I'm not a big shares person, so I'm the first person to read it. I know a lot of you are, and I'm not knocking it. But what I will say is the share market is really almost certainly driven by what happens in the marketplace. People make decisions on the economy all the time. I don't think to the degree that they used to, because I think there are a lot of more mum and dad investors in the stock market today than there were 20 years ago. I think it was very much driven by the institutions before 1987. But the difference, and that's why it's so much higher, of course, than it was in 1987 as well, why it's gone up so dramatically. But the issue is that if a company goes to the wall or bankrupt, you lose all your money. It's not going to happen in a property though, is it? Okay? Because think about this, if the agent suddenly rang you up and said, the property market's fallen by 20%, you've got to put your house in the market. What are you going to say? Why? But why aren't you going to jump the property on the market? Well, it could be your own home. It doesn't necessarily have to be an investment, but either way. But isn't it also the reality is you also got to live somewhere? And that's the difference. Because it is a $700 billion marketplace out there just for residential real estate, most people live in their own homes, don't they? So, and most people live there for a reason. It might be because, you know, they've got friends, neighbours, the local schools, things like that. And who cares? We all know the market's going to double in 7 to 10 years regardless of what the market does short term. So unless people are in financial difficulty, they're not going to dump their property. But if you think a company's going to go broke or it's hitting the wall, what are you going to do with your shares? Get rid of them, aren't you? So that's the point. You always remain in control with property. It's very rare that you're going to worry or panic about the marketplace from that point of view at all. So what drives capital growth? Now, if we have a look at these figures, I might just turn this around. If we look at these particular figures, these are broken down into the states. And as we can see, Sydney, these are probably marginally out of date, but it's based on 207 to 256. And it's showing Sydney with a capital growth of around 1% per annum. This is population. It's about 1.2% in the world's greatest city, Melbourne. Brisbane, for some reason, is 1.6. I don't understand that. Why would anybody want to live up here? Warm weather. You know, what do you do on the weekends if you're bored? You've got to go to the boring old Gold Coast or Sunshine Coast. In Melbourne, we got Geelong. But you can see why a city like Brisbane, which we believe is now in the upswing mode, okay, there are some very good opportunities, I believe, in this particular city, in the state overall. Adelaide, 0.7, but I think with a lot of the mining and everything that's going on there, plus it's probably still the cheapest city, with the exception of Hobart, there'll probably be some opportunities there as well. Perth, my view at the moment, it's saying 1.6% from a low base. It is likely to keep going up in population just because of the amount of jobs, providing the Chinese economy continues to flow. Hobart, 0.6%. But if we have a big drought again in Australia, Hobart was one of the few places that didn't have a drought. In fact, until recently, they weren't even being charged water rates in Tasmania. Do you know that? So who knows, Hobart might become the most expensive real estate in the country one day. But generally speaking, with places like Hobart, people are leaving there because there's not enough population or enough work there. Darwin, 1.5%, but from a low population base. To me, they've been saying that Darwin's going to be going for years. It's going to be the big thing. It's never happened. And I've got my doubts as to whether it ever really will. A lot of the stuff that people were investing in were serviced apartments. They really didn't work that well for a number of different reasons. Canberra, well, that's really, let's face it, it's a population centre with politicians. Our population has actually increased in 3 years from 20,695,000 to just over 22 million. So the population is actually growing quite quickly at the moment. Through immigration, plus of course we've been having record births with kids and things like that as well. I don't necessarily think that, you know, we've got major issues in Australia with infrastructure. and water and things like that. We probably need to build new cities in Australia. And I suppose you've got to do that along the coast somewhere, but you need the infrastructure and water and things like that to sustain it. I mean, we've got to remember that America has a population of 305 million people, land mass about the same as Australia. The difference is most of America, continental America, is usable. Most of Australia isn't, and that's part of the problem. You go inland, how much of the land is actually useful? 50% of the country is uninhabitable, really, most of the time. If we break this down into states, we're saying that New South Wales about 0.8, 1% to Victoria, so on and so forth. Queensland about 1.5%. And when I say Queensland, I'm really talking southeast Queensland. Northern Queensland still not performing very well. Areas like Cairns, we're told all the time that property prices there have actually fallen. And typically what will happen is this, that as the boom keeps going, and it will, have no doubt about it, over the next few years the markets will continue to boom, outer areas will start getting recommended. So people will start talking about, in Queensland, they'll start talking about Cairns again. Great place to invest, people need to move there. I mean, I've noticed in Victoria, there was an article in the paper only a few days ago about saying people should start buying in Ballarat again, because it's an hour out of the city. Now, I'm not knocking Ballarat, but what I can tell you is that it boomed at one point. When the market came back in 2007, Ballarat crashed. Okay, they couldn't sell anything there. Half the mortgage brokers walked out, didn't have jobs. So what happens in a boom is it's like a ripple effect. The market moves up like that and the ripples extend out to outer areas and they lift those areas up, in many cases artificially. But when the market retracts, people put their money back into the safer areas, normally into inner city areas, and those areas and the outer areas crash. The big thing we don't know at the moment is because of all the first home buyers grants, where they've been artificially inflating the first home buyers market, will that actually cause the market to crash in some of the outer areas, or at least come back quite sharply? I think there's a fairly solid risk that that will happen. So that's probably why I'm not a big fan of areas like the Ipswich corridor, for instance. I wouldn't be investing my money there because there's too much land available to purchase. That's just a personal opinion. I mean, there'll be other people that would dare to disagree with me, of course. They do not stay for very long. All jokes aside, there's really no right or wrong answers in property. I have a view of myself and what I like. I don't particularly like house and land packages. And it's not because I don't like house and land, it's just that where are most house and land packages located? Yeah, look, if somebody turned around to me and said they've got a house and land package across the road from the hotel here, and you could buy it for $700,000, I'd go and sign up on it immediately. But are you going to get a house and land package across the road from here for $700,000? And that's the thing. And what a lot of people say is the land is the only thing that goes up. We've all heard this, haven't we? Yeah. Okay. What's a block of land worth in Ipswich? A 700 square metre block of land. 150, 200? What would it be worth if it was across the road here? $1 million? Two? That's the difference. And that's what you've got to understand. When you're looking at apartments or townhouses or whatever, there is still intrinsic land value in it because of where it's located. Supply and demand drive the market, nothing else. Okay? Okay, so understanding your market. So what we're going to talk about is how to source properties. And then I'm going to talk about how to negotiate with real estate agents. Got to be very polite with real estate agents. Now, the first thing you've got to do is you've got to define your geographical area. Why do you need to define your geographical area? What happens? People become frustrated very quickly. So firstly, you've got to determine, in fact, the first thing you've got to determine, what are you investing for? What is your real purpose? Are you a trader or are you an investor? Now, by the way, my definition of an investor is somebody that's buying for at least 10 years. If you're buying for 2 years, you're a speculator. Okay, you're not an investor, in my opinion. So if you're buying a property hoping it's going to go up in value so you can on-sell it for a property, you're a speculator, you're not an investor. We don't encourage people to do that. Now, if you want to be a trader, I do both. So I invest in property and I trade in property. But what I'll often do is I will have different areas for what I do. The reason being is because when I'm investing, I like agents to like me. When I'm trading, they often don't. Because I pull all sorts of nasty stunts. Now, if I was doing the same thing in the same location, I'd never be getting any phone calls from anybody. Because I think I'm a smart aleck, or whatever. And where I'm possible, I try and keep things as quiet as possible. My attitude is I'm in business to make money. And I treat this as a business. And that's what you've got to do as well. So the first thing you've got to determine is, if you're wanting to renovate property or do that, then you've got to really understand your market and you've got to define where it is. If you're going to renovate, is there much point in buying houses that are in the 1960s? You know, these lovely yellow cream brick homes? Do you want to buy those to renovate? Are they going to necessarily give you a maximum return? Or are you going to buy, if you're in Queensland, you'd buy Queenslanders, wouldn't you? You'd find an area here where you could renovate a Queenslander to do it up and on sell it, because that's where the market is. Would that be a fair comment? Okay. So you have to define your geographical area. The second point is build your comfort zone through research. Now, what sort of research would you be doing? Come on, guys, I know it's Sunday morning. Yeah, certainly. I mean, one of the things you want to find out about that if you're going to buy a property, there's not a brothel going in across the road. Oh, that might appeal to some. What else? Services. What else? Infrastructure. Is there public transport nearby? Are there trains and trams or what have, not trams, but trains? Does it have bus services? How close is it to shops? I mean, what I tend to do when I look at property is assume that nobody drives. Now, that doesn't mean I would never buy a property without a car parking space. I wouldn't. But at the same time, assume that there'll be people in that house who don't drive. So if it's close to the shops where somebody can walk around the corner to a milk bar or a shopping centre, is that going to be more attractive than something that's not? Because a property like that is going to be easier to rent in a tighter market. Okay? And despite the fact that we've got a very strong rental market at the moment, there'll be times of the year where it's not as strong as others. So you still want to be very selective on what you buy. What other research would you do? Talk to people that live there's a good one. I mean, one of the things that I'll often do is wander down a street and you see somebody watering the garden. So you walk up to them and say, hi, look, I'm just wondering, I really love this area. I'm really interested in moving here. What do you like about the area? Engage the person in conversation. And then just drop it. Gee, I noticed that house is for sale across the road. Do you know why they're selling? You wouldn't believe it. They fight like cats and dogs. Marital problems. They're going bankrupt. Rule 1, and you should write this down. If you're ever going to sell your home, never tell the neighbours why you're selling. They'll tell you everything. And seriously, I can pretty well guarantee you that 9 times out of 10, I can find out in about 10 minutes why somebody's selling a house. Okay? It is really that easy because people sell, they talk to the neighbours like to tell people everything. Okay? Don't ask me why, they just do. So always do that. Now, what else would you need to do? Clearly, you've got the internet. Okay? Know your market prices and values like the back of your hand. So I'm trying to give you another hint. So to do that, how would you do this?
Go through the papers.
Go through the papers. What else?
Contact a valuer.
Okay, you could contact a valuer, certainly, but that's probably a secondary thing. What else would you do? Sorry? Have a look what else is selling. And how would you do that?
Open houses.
Open houses. Thank you. We're finally getting to the point. The reality is that if you're going to know the market like the back of your hand, you need to really understand what the marketplace is about. Now, a lot of people will say, oh, I just sit on the internet and do that. Do you think that's the solution? No. I don't trust the internet. The internet is great for basic research. That's it. You know, I've already told you about the example yesterday of the apartment complex I looked at. It looked fantastic online, was boarded up when I got there. Keep that in mind. Another example I'll give you is some years ago in New Zealand when I was buying in Christchurch. I just bought a property for $275. It was a 4-bedroom house with that had a master bedroom, had a big shopping centre, Shirley shopping centre just around the corner. So I got a call from an agent. It's a good buy actually. Got a call from the agent, another agent the next day and said, look, I know you just bought this property. I've got another one not far from there and it's red brick and it's returning about 7.5%. He said, look, if you've got a client or you're interested in it yourself, why don't you just buy it? And I said, no, I'm actually here. I'd like to see it. So I turn up to this court. And this court literally has every house in it is an ex-housing commission home. There are 4 car bodies in the street. Okay? Now, do you think I'm going to buy this property? No. Now, the problem is, do you think there'd be people that would buy that because they saw it over the internet? Yeah. Absolutely. And that's the problem. People do these things all the time. And if anybody disbelieves me on this, let me just say this. How many people have ever booked a resort with an Olympic-sized swimming pool that's turned out to be a duck pond when you got there? Trick photography. Keep that in mind. Do you think an agent's ever going to photograph something which is, of a blackened back of the building because, the garage burnt down because they built an amphetamine lab there? You're not going to get that, are you? So you've got to do your own research and you've got to check these things out very carefully. So the other thing is that when you're going through all these properties, you're going to talk to the agents as well. Now, agents are great for getting localised knowledge. Okay? So in terms of just getting the knowledge to find out what an area is like, they're great. Unfortunately, most people, their average amount of research is this. They walk up to the real estate agent and they say, "Excuse me, what do you think the property is going to sell for?" If I had $1 for every time I was asked that when I was an agent, it would have been ridiculous. But the reality is this. Who do agents work for? They generally work for the seller, right? So the fact is that when I was an agent, if you came up to me and you asked me that question and the owner wanted $600,000, I'd tell you $650,000. I would quite happily take you for as much money as you would give me. Why? Because that is my job. That's all an agent can do, is try and get the max amount of money out of you that they can. They're doing their job, and you need to understand that. An agent is not your friend. If you're trying to buy a property, generally speaking, they're not your friend. And if they turn around and tell you, and you think they're your friend, and they say, "Oh, you know, the person's in financial difficulty, they're going through a divorce," are you going to sell through those people? Never.
Don't they want to create a relationship as well?
No, they want to make a sale.
Yeah, but what about the next sale after that?
If you've got something to sell, if you don't have something to sell, why do they care? Think about it. A real estate agent is only driven by their next deal. They're only as good as their last sale.
But you could be there, that deal
And they'll ask that question. And if they find out you've got something to sell, they'll be nice to you. But if you don't, why do they care? They're moving on to the next sale.
But you might want to buy from them the second time. So if they burn you the first time, you're not going to go back to them.
They're worrying about surviving this week. Do you know what the average income is for most agents? It's about $40,000 a year. $40,000 a year is the average salary. Now, I know agents that are making $2 million a year, but a lot of people are earning a lot less than that. So, you know, they're like ants. They're only as good as their next listing. It's a tough industry, let me tell you. I'll explain that when we're going through. Now, apart from going through open for inspections for sale, what else are you going to go through? What other houses will you inspect?
Rentals.
Rentals. Why rentals?
Check out what's been offered for rental.
Okay.
That's the market that you want to be in when you buy a house to rent it out to.
Very good. I mean, the great thing about rental properties, if they're overpriced, it's only going to be by about $20 or $30 a week. They're not going to be way over. So you're going to very quickly get an idea of what the rent should be. Why else are you going to expect rental properties? What would be your other motivation for going through rentals? See how they're being treated. Thanks. That was actually very quick. Normally it takes about 5 minutes to get to that point. Generally speaking, what I always do is I'd go through an open for inspection, and I would say to the tenant that, well, I'd just go through the property, right? And I would act as though I was a potential tenant. Now, very simply, it's this. If they treat me like garbage when I go through the property, do I want that agent to manage my business? No. Because what does it tell you about their duty of care? Zero. What they're saying is that, you know, send anybody through. It's a rental market. You know, here's the application form, fill it out, and then we won't remember you on Monday morning, but whoever stacks up the best and we can get the deal done the quickest, will shove you in the property. What I like is when I still go through properties, if an agent is actually trying to sell me the property in terms of moving into it, they're doing their job. Rare, and it's hard to find good ones, let me tell you. But that's the sort of thing you need to look for. If I walk into a real estate office and they say, give me $50 and I'll give you the keys, I'd never use them either. Okay? I want personal service. So where possible, you want to use agents that don't sell. Because the problem is you need to understand the psychology of real estate agents here from the point of view of rentals. What happens to most agencies is their property management department is really just an appendix to their sales division, right? Most people who own real estate companies are salespeople. And they say, great, this might help generate a bit of income, but more properties to sell. Now, the problem with that is this. What they end up doing is they end up saying, well, it costs me $50,000 or $60,000 a year to employ a property manager, so therefore the figures that I will use is that one property manager can manage 150 properties. The simple reality is that that is nowhere near enough staff to manage those properties and to do the job effectively. When I first got back from the States, one of the things I did, I used to run training courses to teach real estate agents. I tell you what, if you ever want a frustrating job, try that. Whole room full of people that don't actually want to be there, right? And you're trying to tell them how they should be running their business. But one of the things I used to do was also run a course on how to grow your rent roll. And I'll never forget this. I had a group of property managers in a room. And I always go around the room and talk and find out what their situation is, why they're there, the type of company they came from. I got to one particular girl and she said quite proudly, "I'd just been employed to build the rent roll at our agency." I said, "Fine, can you tell me a bit about your agency?" She said, "Well, there's myself and there's the property manager, and we manage 300 properties." I said, "Sorry, excuse me?" So she told me again. I said, "Okay, this is how you fix the problem. The first thing you do is you go back to your office and you tell your boss he's an idiot, because you cannot possibly manage that number of properties and still grow the business." When I owned my own real estate business, I think we had 190 properties. I had a property manager, an assistant property manager, a receptionist, and I still did half the running around. It is a very high maintenance business to do. And think about it, you're the property manager. How often do you get a phone call from the property manager to say, or from the tenant or the landlord, just to say, "Gee, you're doing a great job"? Does that happen, do you think? No, it's normally, "Where's my rent? The hot water service is blowing up." And then you've normally got the landlord not wanting to pay for any of it. And that's another thing I've never understood. People who have their own investments, they don't want to pay for things to be fixed when it's their own property. Crazy, isn't it? You can look at those things as being opportunities. So property management is a very important thing, and how you select your property manager is also important. So when you're in those areas, you want to have professionals that you want to work with. Okay? Do you think property management is going to make your job easier if you have the right one? Absolutely. But you want somebody who is going to work for you. Now, the other benefit with going through open houses, you're generally going to meet the people doing the work. Because I can guarantee you what will happen if you walk into that agency and you walk in there and say, "Hello, my name's Nigel. I've got a property and I want it to manage. I want your office to manage it for me. Can I deal with the person that's going to look after my property?" Do you think the 20-year-old who will actually be doing it will be coming out and meeting you? No offence to 20-year-olds. But who do you think will be the person that will be coming out? It will be the property manager, the senior person running the business, who will come out to impress you. It's a bit like when you get somebody in to list the property. And you get the best person, the owner of the company there, and suddenly you get the 19-year-old junior standing on the door every weekend. Okay? You want to know who's going to be looking after your property. Now, if it is going to be a 20-year-old, I've got no problem with that, but I want to talk to that person and find out that I'm happy that that person's actually going to do the job effectively for me. If you can find an agency that doesn't sell and is purely a rental agency, they're also worth looking at as well. But you want to look at everything. By the way, the fees, not interested. I don't really care. I don't care. I'll pay 7 or 8% or whatever. I'd pay 10% if I can find somebody that actually does the job properly for me. That's the secondary issue. Trust me, 6 or 7%, or paying somebody 4% for somebody that's not actually going to do the job properly for you, is that going to be a great deal? No. So they're the sort of things that are very important when you're doing the initial research. You want to find the professionals in the area that you can actually work with. Now, dealing with real estate agents. When we are dealing with agents, the first thing we really need to do is we need to understand the psychology of agents. Let me ask you, what do people think of real estate agents? Be honest.
Yeah, mine's really good.
Sorry?
I have a good one.
Okay, that's good. My attitude was, when I was once thinking of going to live in America, the only person that I called in was somebody that makes $1.8 million back in those days, the previous year, personally. Why? Because if I'm dealing with somebody, if somebody's earning $1.8 million, do you think they're doing something right? Or would you rather deal with a $40,000 person and then try and cut them on the commission? What do you prefer to do? So it's important. You do get good agents, but the thing is, when you're talking about psychology, the reason it's important, by the way, I'm not here to knock agents. Let me tell you, I've got a lot of agents who are friends of mine. I think it's a really hard profession. I mean, I can tell you, when I was an agent and I worked in Camberwell, when I had my own business, you would be called in of one of 4 or 5 people, and you'd have to come back with a 30-page report, and you'd be sitting in somebody's lounge room at 8 o'clock at night trying to convince them why they should give you the business over somebody else. In some cases, who've just lied to them and told them their property's worth $50,000 more than it was. It is a very tough business. At the same time, as I mentioned to you before, if an agent is there to take money out of your pocket, you need to accept the fact that they are effectively the enemy. And therefore, we have to use every element of in our toolbox, so to speak, to actually use that against them. Would an agent lie to you to get you to pay more money? I mean, how many times have you been told when you've been interested in putting an offer in, somebody else is about to put an offer in on that one as well, right? I hear this so much and I'm so cynical. These days I'll say, fine, sell it to them. Go ahead. But you'll hear this all the time. They'll pull every trick under the sun. Somebody will pay me more than that. And the other thing agents do too is they actually make up their mind on behalf of the vendor whether a vendor will take a figure or not, which I find is even better. So understanding the psychology is really what we're going to talk about here. And then I'll go through some strategies with you on how you can actually set up auctions, how you can do all sorts of things. Now, agents are the barrier between the buyers and the motivated sellers. Let's not make any hesitation about this. The reason most people use agents is to protect them from themselves. Okay? And the reason being is that most people seriously have no idea. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on when I talk about people who are even cleverer, who think they can sell their own properties without using agents. I call those people even bigger targets. They work for themselves, the vendor, and then the buyer. They are well trained in manipulating both the vendor and the buyer. Now, there's a lot of reasons they do this. You know, one of the things I often say to people say, well, agents all lie to get our business, to get us to put the property on the market. Is that fair? They'll come in and overprice the property. But you know why they do that? They do it because they know that their competitor will come in and give an even bigger lie. And what happens to people? They give the property to the person who tells the greatest lie. So really it's your fault. And I say that because if before you allowed an agent in, you knew what your own property was worth, and therefore you appointed an agent based on merit, would you have those problems? Would agents need to lie to you? They wouldn't. Now, I'm not excusing it, I'm just explaining why it happens. And after having spent years and years in a very, very competitive market, I can tell you, for fact, this happens all the time. I even had people that said to me, Nigel, I know that that particular agent lied to us and the property really isn't worth $50,000 more than you've said, but we just think they'll try all the harder to get it for us. They'll actually be trying all the harder to get you down for the next 5 weeks because they know they've lied to you. But it's a matter of understanding that. They cannot necessarily be relied upon to tell you the facts when purchasing. Why would they? If you said to me, when I was an agent, why are those people selling? You'd only ever get two answers. They're scaling up, they're scaling down. Because my personal view was it's none of your business. Right? Really, why these people are selling has absolutely nothing to do with it. Now, if I turn around and say to you it's because they're in a divorce, am I actually damaging their property? Am I potentially lowering their sale? So of course I wouldn't tell you that. But do you think it's useful to know that? If you can find out what somebody's real motivation is, and the way I like to look at it, by the way, it's not always about trying to cheat people or rob people or anything like that. What it's about is knowing that there is a problem and finding a solution to that problem. So I'm going to give you an example of that. Now, for instance, they say that selling your own home is the most stressful thing next to divorce and death. And statistically, we know that to be true. It is a very stressful thing. You imagine, here you are, you've got a family. You've got a house, for the first time you've put it on the market, you may have purchased, you may not have purchased. Well, what will happen in a tight marketplace, or any market for that matter, is you've got kids, let's say, just as an example. The agent rings you up and says, I've got an offer from somebody on your house that's X, and they want a 30-day settlement. If you've got children, and you haven't found anything to buy, is that such an attractive proposition to you, do you think? Why? It's stressful. Not everything is about money. I get a shiver when I say that. But for most people it isn't. You have to understand the psychology of why people are doing these things. And then you've got to understand what the agent's telling people. Now, do you think you're in a strong position being an investor? You are king of the world as an investor. And the reason I say that is because you aren't going to live in the property yourself. So you have tremendous opportunities of actually creating and solving problems for people. So, as an example, let's take the example I just gave you. If I was buying that property myself, what I would do is I would approach either through the agent or directly, and I would say this to the vendor: I will give you X for your property, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a month to stay in the property. I want a 30-day settlement, so I'll give you the money after 30 days. I'm going to give you a further 30 days rent-free to stay in that property after that time. And after that time, we'll work out a commercial, reasonable rent that you can pay me. You can stay in the property for as long as you like until you find the home of your dreams. Now, have I just solved the problem for that particular person? Made a friend. I'm that sort of guy. Now, let me tell you though, is that worth something? Yes. So if they were wanting $400,000 for that house, or let's say $500 for the house, and I offered them 460 and somebody else offered them 470 on a 30-day settlement where they had to move out, which one do you think they're more inclined to look at? Okay, so if I've made $10 or $15 or $20,000 through that transaction, is it worthwhile from my point of view? Absolutely. I've also solved that person's problem and taken the stress away from them as well. I'm not trying to cheat them. I'm not trying to rob them. My attitude very simply is if I can save $10, $20, $30 or $40,000 every time I buy, and that's the profit in the deal. If I was planning on renovating that property, that's $20,000 or $30,000 potentially that I've put straight into the profit before I do anything else, haven't I? Write this down. Remember, folks, the profit when you're renovating or trading is in the buying. The profit is in the buying. Anybody that tells you that the profit is in the renovation doesn't know what they're talking about. And renovation is a subject I could stand here and talk about half a day as well. The rules that are involved in doing that. That's a whole new subject. But when you're purchasing initially, you need to be able to do that. So let's take another example. Let's look at somebody, for instance, who has purchased a property and they have a settlement 35 days hence. As an investor, I can turn around to that person and say, no problem, I will settle the property on the day that you have the settlement to take place. Again, have I solved a problem for those people? Is it worth something to them? So it's about understanding if there is an issue or a problem and learning how you can actually solve the problem. It's not about being a smart aleck or being rude or anything like that. In fact, quite the contrary. If you can deal with these things on a nice manner, you'll only get a lot further than you will anywhere else. Now, there are a lot of other nasty strategies I can talk to you about, but it's a good one. Okay. You have the opportunity of meeting directly with a vendor, and I'm going to go into some real-life examples of how this works a bit later. But there is nothing wrong with you talking directly to an owner. There's no rule that says you have to deal through the real estate agent. There is a rule that you can't go to a vendor expecting them to not pay the agent. That's actually fraud. Okay? And this is not what this is all about. It's about finding out what a person's motivation is. And the real advantages with all of this are actually working out what the motivation is behind the vendor. Okay, so let's talk about a couple of strategies. First one is purchasing at an auction. How many people think it's easy to buy a property at a good price at an auction? Okay, the auction system is a great system. And the reason being is because the reason you have auctions in a lot of great areas is because there is always less product on the market than there are buyers. So it works very, very well for the seller. But you've got to remember that again, when an auction campaign is taking place, it's very much based on what they're being told by the agent all the way through. Now, I'm not sure how far I should go with this particular example. Should I or shouldn't I? Yes. I don't know whether this is illegal in Queensland, okay? I think there may be some problems in Victoria, so I don't believe, but I remain ignorant of these things. Okay, what happens at a lot of auctions? Do they pull bids from trees and from dummy bidders and things like that, knowingly trying to push the price out? What this strategy is really simple. We're going to do the same thing back to them. And the way it works is like this. If you're looking to buy a property, you get two other people or two other couples, it doesn't matter what the configuration is, but you send those people through the open for inspections independently of yourself, and you get them to express interest in the property. Now, if you want a building inspection on the property or you want documentation, you get one of the other two people to do it, not yourself. You also show interest in the property, by the way. Now, what happens is this. When you get to the day of the auction itself, the agent will be standing outside the front of the property or the room or how it happens to be done, depending on where you are. But they will be looking for familiar faces. And they will look at the people that have expressed interest. And what happens, they have a vendors conference that takes place just prior to the auction itself. And they will normally say, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Smith are there, Barbara's there, Julie's there as well. The three people, there might be five people. And they will say to you, right, what sort of reserve price do you want to get? Now at this point, the vendor normally who doesn't trust the agent. And remember that, no one trusts the real estate agent. That's the second thing. Nobody trusts the agents. So at this stage, they might say, no, we've said all the way along, the reserve's 500,000, that's what we want it to be. So what I do is a little different. How often have you been to an auction and you find nothing happens? Everyone stands there whistling, you know, waiting for something to occur. Well, I instruct normally the opposite, and it will depend on the particular situation of the property. It'll also depend whether it's been taking place at the property. But what I do is I say to the people this, what I want you to do is to bid to $460,000 actively. It might be $450,000, but as a figure. We set the figure beforehand. But I want you to start bidding aggressively from the moment they call for bids. Why would I do that? Sorry? Yeah, to get it started, but why else would I do it? Yeah, what else though might it do? It might potentially scare off any other real bidders, because you're going to take an auction up really fast. Now, the other thing it's going to do, it's going to give the vendor a false sense of security that there's really solid interest in the property. So what happens, the property gets to 450, 460, whatever the figure is, the auction stops, because the bidding stops. Okay? Now what's going to happen then is the agent is going to walk inside to the vendor and say, Mr. Vendor, great news. There are 3 people or 4 people or 5 people or whatever it happens to be, all bidding. It stopped at 460. I know you want 500,000, but you've got to admit, since they've been bidding to this point, there's got to be a pretty good chance that if we release the property for the sale, the property will keep going up. If the vendor releases the property for sale, yes, sure, there's a chance that somebody else might come in. But you think there's a pretty good chance that they won't? And is anybody else going to bid? No. If the bid didn't land on me, I might put in another $5,000. But then in other words, I could buy that property potentially for $30,000 or $40,000 under the value of what it really should be. You like that strategy? What's the worst thing that's going to happen? They pass the property in. It gets passed in to me. The other people walk. They just walk. They shake their heads and they walk. I'm still in a very strong position to then go inside and play hardball and negotiate. And you know what? I'm in a no-lose situation. Do I care if somebody else buys the property? There's another one around the corner. Because the whole point is that what you're going to do in your given area is track what the market is doing. Now, the one thing you never do with this strategy is you don't walk up to the agent and say, tricked you! Because the reality is, nobody likes a smartass. And frankly, if you've done this properly, why make yourself feel good by making somebody else feel stupid? Because if you've done this properly, there's no way they would know about it in the first place. This is a strategy to make money. That's what this is about. And it's about saving that $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 that you're going to have in your pocket to move ahead. Even if you're a long-term investor. If you're $30,000 or $40,000 ahead of the pack because you've bought this property well, is that good for you? And people often say, well, you know, if it's only $10,000 or $20,000, why would you bother? How long does it take you to save $10,000 or $20,000, folks? And if you were doing 3 or 4 of these a year, is that pretty good extra income? Absolutely. Even if you were just trading properties. So keep in mind, there are those things, you can do those things all the time. I remember as an agent years ago, God, it was funny. We had a guy as a vendor bidder when it was still legal in Victoria to do this. And I remember the auctioneer we had, and the vendor bidder kept going. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I think we were ready to throttle this bloke. And he kept going. I mean, it sold, and luckily the person that bought it. But my God, I mean, that was such a dangerous thing to do because he could have blown his own property up. What are you doing? But the reality is, if agents do these things, is there anything wrong with doing what I've suggested? Right? The whole thing is, the idea of doing this is to make money, isn't it? Okay. How many people are uncomfortable with this strategy? Anybody? Be honest. It's okay. Okay. Now the other thing, talking about auctions. When have you purchased a property in an auction? At what point do you own the property? Or at what point are you committed to it? When the hammer goes down? That is actually incorrect. An auction is purely a marketing exercise. So in fact, the only time you purchased a property at an auction is when contracts are signed and exchanged and a 10% deposit has been paid, or whatever the agreed deposit is. Only at that point is the property physically sold. In other words, you could stand there at an auction if you wanted to, the hammer could fall and you go, bye-bye, jump in the car and drive off. Now, I'm not actually suggesting you should do it, right? You might get somebody else to do it. No, I would never do that. I would never actually deliberately do something like that. But the reason I tell you this, it's important for you to understand that if you're actually at an auction and you've gotten caught up in it and you feel you've actually paid too much, you can actually walk away from it, right? You can walk away from it. Don't ever do this deliberately because they would have some right to take legal action against you if it was done. And I would never do that to somebody. But it is a matter of understanding the law and the rights and the obligations that you have. I mean, technically, you could get inside the property and then want to start negotiating conditions. You'd be a pretty brave person to do it, probably with 3 agents standing there. But you can do that. Because until those contracts are actually signed and exchanged, you've got nothing. When I was an agent, if we did an auction, what we'd do is we'd bring each party in separately. We'd get the vendors at one end of the house, tell them to shut up. We'd bring the purchasers in, sign them up, do everything, exchange contracts, and only at that point would we introduce them. And we would say to the vendors, no popping the champagne corks, no hugging and dancing and saying we can't believe the price. because you won't have the price. If somebody sees it, they could walk. Okay? So I say this to you because it really is important to understand the things. Now, I could talk all day about this subject as well, because there are so many different ways at an auction that you can negotiate. But the reason I talk about this particular strategy, it does work even in a hot market, because it's very, very difficult to buy a property at auction otherwise in that sort of competitive environment. So the only way to do it is to actually create an environment that isn't quite real. Okay? Now, purchasing after an auction is where, and you can use the same example that I just gave you, where the property is now being passed into you as an individual. You see, in most auctions, in most states, the auction system still applies for 3 days before and 3 days after. But at the same time, when you're sitting there, you can still negotiate with them. And there's nothing to stop you at that point from negotiating differently. The other thing you need to understand here is the psychology. Imagine that you're a vendor. Has anyone ever sold a property by auction where it hasn't sold? Okay. How do you feel when your property hasn't been sold at auction, when you're standing there? Bit annoyed? A bit annoyed with the agent, because what happens in a modern auction is this. In many cases, you may have committed $5,000, $10,000, $12,000 to an auction campaign, and then the agent's saying to you, well, we can start again next week because nobody wanted your house. Now, the reality is it might have happened for a number of reasons. It might have happened because, in fact, you had unrealistic expectations of what your property was worth. It doesn't matter. The fact is that the agent is the person who they will blame. But the other thing that happens at this point is that the vendor is at a very low ebb. They will never be more depressed for another 6 or 7 weeks. They're very vulnerable. And what I find is that at this point, if you can negotiate with them, you will often get a deal done. Because think about it, the agent's ready to go to the next open for inspection or the next auction. They're suddenly thinking, God, how am I going to fit this into my schedule? I'm going to have to keep opening this house. Suddenly what I normally do, if I'm at an auction and this has happened, I will normally wait until they've gone in, negotiated, and they're coming in to take the flag down. Then I'll walk up and say, I might be interested. Who do you think the agent is now working for? You. Me. Because they want to get a deal. When you go inside and start talking to the vendor or start negotiating, if you're within a ball's roar, and it might be that you can save $10,000 or $20,000 in this type of situation as well, do you think you've got a pretty good chance of doing it? Now, if you're going to do this, you need to do it on the day. It's no good coming back the next day, because I can pretty well guarantee you that by the next day the vendor's resolve is back. And in fact they're saying, right, I didn't get my price, I want my figure, I'm going to hang out to get it, in most cases. Okay? So the emotion and everything of the auction is there at the time. That is the time to actually act at that moment. So guys, if you're going to trade in a particular area, what you've got to do is you've got to buy a scrapbook. Okay? And what you should be doing is cutting out every single property that's listed for sale, go through it and then track it, so you know exactly what that property is doing from a price point of view, and also just from the point of view of you know, have there been price reductions? Has anything occurred? I mean, if 6 weeks later the property's at the same price, what does that tell you? Well, it tells you that the vendor's not listing or the agent's doing a really bad job. So hopefully you'll see some price alterations along the way. So generally speaking, once we're at that point, I will then perhaps go back to the property, but I try a slightly different technique at that point. Now, what I tend to do is this. What I need actually, I'd like a couple of volunteers. I have a couple of volunteers, please. Now guys, Joshua, in this case, you're going to be a vendor and Brett is going to be an agent. Okay. Now what happens is this. Joshua's house is the house that passed in for $500,000 and it just sat there for 6 weeks and nothing's happened. Now tell me, Josh, at this point, Joshua, how are you feeling about the agent you've been dealing with? What would you think if you don't? Why don't you trust him?
He didn't sell my house.
He didn't sell your house, and what's happened over the last 5 weeks?
He hasn't done nothing.
Done nothing. Have you heard much from him at all?
Nope.
No, okay. And this is quite typical, and often it happens because the agent's also embarrassed. Because after a while, when they're not getting a response, do you think they want to keep ringing the vendor? Gets to the point where they think, my God, this is uncomfortable. And how would you be feeling about this property at this point, Brett?
I just want to hope it disappears.
He hopes it's going to disappear. Okay.
Then pass it on to someone else. They can deal with it.
Okay, so what I would do, I would be tracking this property to see what's happening. And about 6 weeks later, what I would do is this. At about 9:45 on a Sunday morning is a pretty good time I always find. I would pick the phone up, I would ring Brett, and I'd say, hi Brett, my name's Nigel, I'm interested in such and such a property, and I'd like to make an offer on.
Great.
Okay. Well, now remember the price on the property is $500,000. Now what I would do in this instance, I say, right, Brett, my offer is $400,000. What would your response be?
Are you crazy? 400,000?
I've often been called crazy, but that's my offer.
What would I do? I guess I'd just still offer that to the vendor.
Okay.
And I'd just say, hey, no one else, there's been no other interest whatsoever. This is the best I can do at the moment.
Okay. You may do that, but is it likely that Brett would immediately get on the phone and put an offer like that up to the vendor? It's not, is it? I mean, it's a Sunday morning. He's thinking, my God, I've got somebody on the phone who's probably a bit of a Fruit Loop ringing me up and making me an offer 100,000 under. It's probably not going to be his highest priority on his Sunday off, is it? Okay, or his Sunday. But what he doesn't know is I'm actually parked around the corner from his house. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to knock on Joshua's door. I'm going to say, hi, look, my name's Nigel. You are?
Josh.
Look, Josh, I'm really sorry for disturbing you first thing on a Sunday morning, but I've actually made an offer on your property through the agent. I'm just wondering if it's been passed on to you yet. Now, what have I just done? Have I totally destroyed the agent's credibility at this point? Okay. Now, what would your response be likely be, Josh, at that point?
I'd be straight on the phone to Brett and finding out why he hadn't put the offer through.
Okay.
Either that, after I'd spoken to you, I'd ask you personally what your offer was.
Okay, my offer was 400,000.
No.
What would you take?
Well, at this point, I'd probably drop as much as 40 or 50 grand.
Okay, so you take
From the
450.
original.
Why are you selling, by the way, Josh?
Relocating,
Okay.
work reasons.
Okay. You see, what's happened here at this point is that often the vendor believes they're smarter than the agent. So if somebody like me, who's reasonably good at manipulating people in this respect, and in terms of negotiation, can talk to Josh, I'll just be matter of fact. I'll be saying, yeah, it's really bad. Agent service is really poor these days. I buy properties, I do this sort of stuff all the time, and agents never get back. We just have a mutual knock session. But the reality is that the more Josh gets to know me, the more he's going to tell me, isn't it? The more he's going to tell me about his circumstances. Now, if Josh slammed the door in my face, which happens, do I care? I go to the next one. Statistically, 5 or 6 people out of 10 will stop and negotiate with me at the very least. And again, if I can buy that property for 450 when he wanted 500 and it's really worth 480, is that a good deal to me? Was that worth knocking on the door and talking to him directly? Now, at the end of the day, will Brett be pissed at me? Absolutely. Of course he will. I won't even repeat in this room, particularly while we're on camera, girls and boys, on some of the things that have actually been said to me by agents. But the thing to keep in mind is it's amazing how quickly that disappears when we're signing the contracts. And I'm always very polite and nice to the agents. So I say, look, you negotiate on behalf of the vendor. I negotiate on behalf of either clients for myself or for me. And that's why I play hardball too. No offence, nice doing business with you. Most of the time, there's no issue at all. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll give these guys a big hand. Thanks, guys. Thanks. But do I really care if I've offended the agent? No. Why should I? Do you think the agent would hesitate to tell me somebody else is coming in with an offer of 490 or 500? Or try and get me to commit to the property? So all I'm doing is negotiating in reverse in much the same way. But why I say you need to treat this like a business is if you don't know your pricing, you don't know all these things back to front, you're likely to make mistakes, aren't you? Because I've done this to people. I mean, I've seen people pay ridiculous prices for property, right? Now the next question, if you buy a property and you pay too much for it, does it matter? If you're buying a property over 20 years and that's what you're keeping and you pay $20,000 too much for it, it really doesn't matter if it's the right property. I've paid over the odds for properties before. But my attitude, if it's the right property I'm buying for long-term investment, who cares? When I was an agent, I saw people, I'd be cringing with some of the prices people pay. I saw 5 years later them selling that property and I thought, well, what does it matter? What did it matter what they paid for that property 5 years ago when you look at what they got for it today? But if you're trading and if you're going to renovate that property to sell and you pay $20,000 too much, you are screwed. You might as well forget it. You're not going to make any money out of that property at all. So if you're wanting to be a trader, the price you pay for the property is absolutely paramount. How many people here would be happy now to go and knock on somebody's door? How many people wouldn't be? Okay, that's fine. And I mean, you've got to do what you're comfortable with doing. And I've been doing this stuff for a long time, so I know how to negotiate. I never deliberately try and make somebody look silly though. And part of the reason for that is I've seen a lot of professional investors when I was an agent. And oh God, I mean, seriously, I've looked at some of these turkeys and I've thought to myself, I wonder how much I can take you down for. You're such a smart aleck. And if you have any idea what you're doing, these people have bought one property and they think they're geniuses. Yes, sir, back of the room.
Don't they normally ask you to come in and sign a contract before they put the offer in, or will they take your offer over the phone?
Often they'll do both. I mean, an offer has no binding unless it's in writing, but let me ask you, if somebody said to me, I'll only put that offer of $400,000 if it's in writing, I'll be in there like a flash. My attitude is I'll pay them a 10%. What's the worst thing that's going to happen? The vendor says no. What if they say yes? I mean, one of the things that agents do all the time is they make up their minds on behalf of the vendor on what they're going to take. And often, because vendors do not trust agents, they don't tell them the full story, which is the biggest mistake they can actually make. Agents should actually tell people why they're selling if they're in difficulty, because often a good agent will actually understand that and try and help the person. I mean that quite genuinely. People don't tell them their circumstances and they play hardball. Often they do themselves a lot of disservice. But if I can get to that person, they'll tell me what their real reason is for selling. Well, it's a much more powerful position to be in. Now, when you're dealing with somebody, however, who is the vendor and the seller, and let me tell you, I would never sell my own property. And I've got a lot of experience, but I would never sell my own property. I would always go through an agent. Why? Why do you think that is? You're too emotionally close to the whole thing, right? It doesn't matter what I say, I'm going to come across as desperate because it's my property. Now, I worked for a company called Sinclair & Company, and then I went out and opened my own business with a partner of mine. And what we found was, here we were in those days, two reasonably young blokes who, it was probably about Conrad's age actually when we went out. And we went out and opened our own business. We thought we were a couple of hot shots from one of the biggest companies. And suddenly we were really an agency with a shingle on the door because we couldn't take any of our previous clients with us. So we're starting off from scratch. So we had to start doing things we hadn't really done in years, knocking on doors and going through private sales. And that was fascinating because the one thing we learnt was that whenever we sat down with people, and by the way, what agents would do is they'd ring up the private sellers and go, why are you doing that? You might as well, if I get more money for you, would you sell it through me? What I would do is I would actually ring the private sellers up and I said, look, I just wanted to give you a call. I'm Nigel Kibel from Burn Macmillan. The reason I'm calling you is because I've noticed that you're trying to sell your own property. Now, we do this for a living and I find it pretty tough. So I just thought we'd give you a ring and see if you needed any advice or anything like that, we'd be only too happy to come out and offer you some advice on what you're doing. 9 times out of 10, people would say, oh, okay. You'd go over. And the one thing they would always tell you, and I'll remember this as, is without a doubt, people would say to me, Nigel, we've had a lot of people go through the property. Everybody likes it, but nobody's made an offer. And do you know why? They know the reason that happens is because people are too polite. Most people wouldn't be rude directly to the vendor. Do you think I'm in that category? No. So I learnt from that. So what I would do, the scenario I gave you before about setting up an auction? I would do the same thing with a private sale, particularly where, and I can do this with a normal private sale, but particularly where it's a vendor. And the first thing I would do is this. If I found a fault with the property, I would send somebody through the property and be within earshot of the vendor, and they'd laugh. Can you believe the kitchen in this property? What a joke. They would do something to demoralise the vendor. The next thing they would do, I would send people through the property, and if they were after $500,000, I'd get them to make offers of around 4 on the property all the way through, and then finally I would come along a week or two later and then make an offer of 440, 450 and save them. Easy, easy, easy. These people have got red targets written all over them because they think that they can save some money by doing it themselves. Do I feel sorry for these people? No, I don't. They decide to go to the open market as experts to market their own properties. They need to know how to negotiate and do the same thing. I do the same thing to them. So you should watch out for people that do this as well, because generally they do it because they think they're going to save $5 by not using an agent, or they're smarter than an agent, or they've had a bad experience. One of those 3 things only. Okay? So keep that in mind. Finally, because I need to do an exercise and I want to give you a bit of time for that. And finally, the last thing I want to talk to you about is what if I could tell you about how you could increase the price, say, of an apartment or a townhouse before you purchase it. Would you like to know that?
Definitely.
Okay. Well, what I do is this. Normally I go through the opens, and you'll know if a property's tenanted because the agent will naturally tell you, because there has to be a lease incorporated within a document, generally speaking. So what I'll normally do is, there's a couple of reasons. Naturally, if it's an apartment, I'll know they're pretty stock standard, but I'll go through the apartment. Why would I want to inspect it? See what the tenant's like. I mean, if I walk in there and there's a week worth of dishes sitting in the sink, do I want to buy that property? Because I think to myself, if these people don't even have enough pride knowing that people are coming through it to clean up a bit, what are they going to be like when no one's coming through it? Worse. What I will then do is I will normally go back to the property after the open for inspection and knock on the door. And I'd say, hello, Mr. Tenant. It was Tenant. My name's Nigel. Please forgive me for knocking on your door and disturbing you. But I'm an investor. I want to buy this property for investment, and I just wanted to meet the person who's actually looking after it. Now, what have I done straight away by doing that? Create a relationship. What else?
You've made them feel like they've got control of the property.
Yeah, what's the biggest fear most tenants have? When they're going to get kicked out because they're no longer on a lease. The property's being sold, so somebody can buy it as an owner-occupier. So firstly, what I've done is I've told them I'm an investor. So I've really told them that, you know, if I buy this property, they can stay there. So there's a fair amount of anxiety that's been removed. Now, if they say F off and close the door in my face, great, they've done me a big favour. Okay? But often what will happen is that people will invite me in and I'll sit and have a chat. Normally what I say to them is this. I'll say, well, okay, since I'm buying this property, perhaps, and you live here, so it's really your home, tell me, what do you like about it? And they'll normally run off half a dozen reasons, the area, the neighbours, what have you. And of course, if they tell me something really bad, like there's some really bad people living next door or something, well, that's another reason maybe to back away. But I'll normally then turn around and say to them, okay, well, what don't you like about the property? And they might say, well, you know, in summer it gets really hot here. It might be that, you know, the shag pile carpet was really popular in the 70s, but the stove doesn't really work properly. And I'll then turn around and say to them, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll put in air conditioning for you. I'll put in a new stove. I'll get a nice European appliance in here for you. How's that? You can even pick out the brand. And we'll polish the boards. Now, if I'm prepared to do that, would you be prepared to pay an extra $30 a week and sign a lease? Now, what I've done straight away is that I've got a tenant that actually wants to stay living in the property, because what have I done? Have I solved their problems? Yeah. Do I necessarily need to use an agent? No, I probably don't. In most cases these days I do, because it's too much hassle. But by doing these sort of things, whether I do it for myself or for somebody else, I can then go in and start negotiating with Brett, the agent there, in all the ways I mentioned before, and play hardball. But I know that if I buy that property, I'm going to be able to increase the rent by at least $30 a week, improve the value of the property by putting those things in, and the tenant's paying for it and they're happy to do it. Is that a good strategy? Okay, so even though I've got limited time, I mean, I could talk about some of these things all day. I know Conrad's always happy for me to stay on stage for many hours over. He's just shaking his head at the back of the room. That's why he gets here, to make sure he can throw me off. Okay, I'll keep moving through. But I hope some of those strategies that I've gone through this morning you've at least found interesting. It's really to make you think about what's available out there. Yes, sir?
Sorry, just quickly, so from what you're saying now, this is the 80% psychology
Oh, absolutely.
of any strategy.
Absolutely. You've got to, if you go into war, if you look at, I mean, I was watching a movie the other day on Patton, George Patton. And when you look at a general like George Patton, who used to study the classics, as he would say, most wars are strategic. You had the German High Command actually studying every aspect of George Patton's psychology to know what to do, how to handle it. Everything is like that. You've got to treat all these things as a battle, right? And when you're going in to do it, you have to understand the psychology of those people that you're dealing against. I've got nothing against agents. I mean, I know some agents that are terrific people. But you've got to understand that the average person out there doesn't trust agents. I mean, when I asked you, what do you think of agents, most people in the room called out a whole lot of things, which is what the general public think of them. That's psychology you're dealing with, and that's what vendors will think of the agents as well. No one trusts them, okay? And that's why, if you understand that, then you know how to basically go into a negotiation principle. Okay, so just moving forward quickly. Understand that you can approach the vendor directly. Making offers for the property, verbal or in writing, it really doesn't matter. As an agent, I would never take a verbal offer because it has no legal standing, okay? That doesn't mean that people won't do that, particularly if you're well under. Because if the real reason I make an offer of, say, $400,000 when the price is $5,000 is because I know 9 times out of 10 the agent will just dismiss it. 9 times out of 10 the agent will call me a crackpot and think I'm a waste of time and tell me that the vendor won't accept the price, right? If I offered them $470,000, they'd be asking me to come put it in writing. Okay? Ideally, I don't want them doing that. The best scenario for me is when the agent hangs up on me. Because that really, that's more fun. So if I go too high in that instance, I'm actually putting myself in a position, if they start treating me seriously, they're more inclined to ring the owner and do all those things. So, Learn to make ridiculous offers. Always make offers preferably conditional. Okay? You generally will find it very difficult to buy a property prior to auction. If you buy it prior to auction, it generally means that you've paid more than what the owner wanted. Okay, so it's very hard to negotiate a property prior to. Always provide yourself with an out. Make it subject to the sun setting in the west if you like. But check it out. Building inspections are always a good one. If I'm going into a property where the property's been passed in an auction, I'll nearly always make it subject to a building inspection if it's an older property. Gives you an out. Then you'll bring your own builder in. Ensure that your solicitor approves the contract of sale, ideally before you sign anything. Now, I'm just going to talk to you very briefly about our Property Express weekend in Brisbane. We take your investment education to the next level. So what we're going to do is we're going to teach you how the export source property. So how many people would like to spend a weekend with me where all we're going to do is teach you how to source property? How we source the property, how we find it, how we source projects, and how we put them all together. Okay? Well, that's what we're now doing. It's one of our products. So our main is to educate you how to source the right properties, advanced negotiation skills with agents and private sellers, learn about the 52-point checklist. So Duncan Hall, who does these with me, will actually go through the 52-point checklist on exactly how we actually put projects together here. Using PIA software, we teach you how to use that particular software, which is probably one of the easiest software packages around. We talk to you about the Australian property market, past, present and future. And I also talk about foreign investment markets, New Zealand and the United States, including different loan structures. How to develop a life and business plan in more detail. We actually get you to do it. Okay? I don't give you the option to go home and do it overnight when everyone goes to sleep. And how to treat it as a business. To challenge your current beliefs about property and research. To learn research property and understand how to do your own due diligence in detail. Okay? You're dealing with people that do this every day of the week. Do you think we might be able to teach you something? If nothing else, I hope you realise that I've got some idea of what I'm talking about. To look at real opportunities and see how we do our due diligence. So we're actually going to take you to opportunities that we've sourced, generally speaking, that are not available in the general marketplace, and give you the opportunity to buy them. Now, the next trip is on the 27th and 28th of February in Brisbane. Now, Christine has the forms. The price is only $95. It actually covers lunch on the Sunday, and it covers the cost, obviously, of the bus. Now, there is one criteria with this, though. It is a buying trip, and I'm not going to make any bones about this at all. The reason we run these trips is to create and show you opportunities. Now, it doesn't mean you've got to buy, but what it does mean is you have to qualify to purchase. So what happens here is that if anybody is interested in going on this particular trip, on the Property Express weekend, so it's a full day of education, actually at this particular hotel, right at this venue. We spend all day Saturday basically doing the education. We spend all day Sunday going out and actually looking at the opportunities. But the secret here is that when you fill this form out, you give the form back to Christine, fill the form out during the break to Christine, give it back to her. It will not be processed, however, until you've filled out the fact finder and you've been pre-approved for finance. Now, the reason we're doing this, folks, is not because we're trying to put pressure on people to buy. The problem here is that what we're trying to do is we really only want to limit these to 30 people approximately on any of these bus trips. We have a 48-seater bus, we only want 30 people, and because of that, we really want people that are serious about their investment future. Okay? Thank you, folks. Break into the groups.